The little boy stopped asking when his mother was coming home. That was how Kwon Mujin knew something inside his son had finally broken. Rowan used to fill the enormous mansion with laughter. He raced through its marble corridors, hid beneath expensive tables, and climbed into his father's bed before sunrise with a new question every morning. Now he barely spoke. He sat at the end of a birthday table surrounded by 60 empty chairs, wearing a paper hat that had slowly slipped over one eye. Before him stood an untouched plate of food and a glass of juice he had not lifted once. At the opposite end of the table sat his father. Kwon Mujin had once been the most feared Korean mafia boss in Seoul, a billionaire whose name could silence crowded rooms and make powerful men answer their phones in the middle of the night. Now he sat in a wheelchair inside his own mansion, struggling to hide how badly his hands were trembling. A rare illness had stolen the strength from his legs and stripped away everything people had once admired about him. His relatives had stopped visiting when his recovery became slow and inconvenient. His associates had transferred their loyalty to healthier men. Caregivers had resigned one after another, exhausted by the long nights, his anger, and the demands of caring for a proud man who hated needing help. Even his wife had left. She had emptied several accounts, packed her jewelry, and disappeared without saying goodbye to their child. Yet Mujin had still ordered the staff to prepare a birthday dinner. Perhaps some foolish part of him believed his family would remember the years he had protected them. Perhaps he wanted Rowan to see that they were not completely alone. But the food had gone cold. The candles had burned halfway down. Nobody came. Rowan looked across the table at his father and quietly asked, "Did they forget you too?" Mujin felt the question enter his chest like a blade. He could command men with guns. He could ruin companies with a phone call. But he did not know how to explain to a 4-year-old that people often called themselves family only as long as a man remained useful. Mujin reached for the tablecloth, ready to drag the cake, the plates, and every humiliating reminder of the evening onto the marble floor. Then the front door opened. A black woman stood beneath the chandelier, damp from the rain and visibly uncertain whether she had entered the wrong house. One hand held a modest gift bag. The other held the hand of a little girl from Rowan's preschool. Rowan had quietly told several classmates that his father was having a birthday. He had not handed out proper invitations. He had simply mentioned that there would be a large cake. Most of the children forgot about it before the school day ended. Nayawira's daughter did not. She came home with the address written unevenly on a folded piece of paper and insisted that they attend because Rowan had said nobody might come. Nayawira had nearly refused. They were new to Seoul. She had never met Rowan's father, and arriving at a stranger's mansion because of an invitation passed between two 4-year-olds sounded like a perfect way to embarrass herself. But her daughter would not let the matter go. So Nayawira bought a modest present, dressed them both for the rain, and followed the address across the city. She had not expected an enormous mansion, and she certainly had not expected the lonely man seated at the end of the table to be Kwon Mujin. Before Nayawira could apologize and leave, her daughter released her hand and ran toward Rowan. For the first time that evening, the quiet boy lifted his head. His classmate stopped beside his chair, looked at the empty room, and frowned. "Why are you sitting so far apart?" she asked. Nobody answered. So she dragged her small chair across the polished floor and placed it directly beside Rowan's. The sound echoed through the mansion. Then she reached into the gift bag, pulled out a crooked paper crown, and placed it on Mujin's head before anyone could stop her. Nayawira's eyes widened. Mujin's remaining staff froze. The little girl studied the feared billionaire in his wheelchair and said, "My mommy said birthdays are not supposed to look this sad." Mujin stared at her. No one had spoken honestly to him in months. Then Rowan made a sound his father had almost forgotten. A small laugh. It was weak and uncertain, but it was there. Nayawira looked toward the quiet boy, then at the lonely man at the other end of the table. She could not have known that by walking through those doors, She had stepped into the remains of a shattered family. She could not have known that Mujin had forgotten how to be a father without staff, a husband without a wife, or a man without the power his body once gave him. And she certainly could not have known that before the night ended, the feared Mafia boss would ask a near stranger for the one thing he had never begged anyone to give him: help. Not for himself, for his little boy who had finally laughed again. Please subscribe, like this video, and join our growing family. I'm working toward my first 10,000 subscribers, and your support means more than you know. Now stay with me, because Nayawira had only come to brighten one birthday. But before long, she would become the one person capable of changing Quan Mujin's entire life. For a long moment, nobody in the dining hall seemed to know what to do with the silence her daughter had broken. "I'm so sorry," Nayawira said quickly, stepping forward to retrieve her daughter, Wanjiru, who was already climbing into the chair she had dragged beside Rowan's. She heard there was a birthday, and she wouldn't let it go. "We didn't mean to intrude on." She looked around at the 60 empty chairs and the untouched cake, and something in her chest tightened before she even understood why. "You are not intruding," Mujin said. His voice surprised her. It was low and even, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. But there was something underneath it that sounded almost like relief, quickly buried. An older woman in a housekeeper's apron appeared from a side hallway, wringing her hands. "Bring another plate," Mujin said, not looking away from Nayawira. "And find something the child will actually eat." "Not this." He gestured, with visible effort, at the elaborate spread that had clearly been designed to impress adults who never arrived. Nayawira hesitated by the doorway. She had heard the name Quan Mujin before, the way most people in the city eventually did if they lived there long enough. Murmured on television, mentioned in hushed tones by people who worked in certain buildings downtown, discussed with a kind of respectful fear. She had pictured someone else. Not this. Not a man folded into a wheelchair with trembling hands and a paper crown sliding sideways over silver-streaked hair, watching his son laugh for what was clearly the first time in a long while. "I should take my daughter home," she said. "It's late, and this looks like..." She stopped herself before she said a private tragedy. "Please stay," Mujin said. It was not quite a request, and not quite an order. It came out somewhere in between, as if he had forgotten how to simply ask for something without expecting resistance. Wanjiru had already pulled Rowan's paper hat back into place and was explaining, with the seriousness only a 4-year-old could summon, that the candles needed to be lit again because they had gone out from being sad. Nayawira looked at her daughter, then at the boy beside her, thin, quiet, watching Wanjiru as though she were the only solid thing in the room, and found she could not make herself leave. She stayed for the cake. She stayed while the housekeeper, whose name was Ms. Beck, relit the candles with hands that shook slightly, whether from age or nerves. Nayawira couldn't tell. She stayed while Rowan blew them out with Wanjiru's help, and while Mujin watched his son with an expression Nayawira recognized instantly, because she had worn it herself more times than she could count since becoming a mother alone in a country not her own. The particular exhaustion of loving someone fiercely while feeling completely unequipped to protect them from the world. When the cake had been eaten, by the children, mostly, since neither adult touched their slice, Mujin's driver offered to take Nayawira and Wanjiru home in one of the mansion's cars. Nayawira declined, politely but firmly, and called a taxi instead. She was still new enough to soul, and cautious enough as a single mother in a place that sometimes looked at her a beat too long on the street, that she did not accept rides from strangers, however large their house. But before she left, standing in the marble foyer with Wanjiru already half asleep against her shoulder, Mujin wheeled himself to the doorway. "Ms. Jichuru," he said. He had learned her surname from the school records Ms. Beck had produced within minutes, the kind of efficiency that told Nayawira this man was used to information appearing the moment he wanted it. "I would like to ask you something," and I would like you to feel free to refuse it. That's a generous offer for a man who just had his housekeeper pull my daughter's school file, Nyawira said. Something flickered across his face. It took her a second to identify it as surprise, and another second to realize it might have been the first genuine reaction he'd had all evening that wasn't grief. I need help with my son, he said simply. Not domestic help. I have people for that, when they don't quit. A dry, humorless edge crept into his voice. I mean help understanding him. I do not know what he eats anymore, or why he flinches when the intercom rings, or why he stopped drawing pictures of his mother 2 months before she left, as though he already knew. I am asking you because your daughter is the first person who has made him laugh since March. Nyawira studied him for a long moment. The chandelier light made the exhaustion under his eyes look almost blue. I'm not a nanny, Mr. Kwan, she said. I have a job. I have my own daughter. I don't know the first thing about your world, and honestly, from what I've seen tonight, I'm not sure I want to. I'm not offering you a job as a nanny. His jaw tightened. I'm asking a mother for advice, because I have run out of people who will give it to me honestly instead of telling me what they think I want to hear, so I don't fire them. It was, Nyawira thought, the most human thing anyone with that much money had ever said to her. I'll think about it, she said, which was not a yes, and they both understood that. She left with her sleeping daughter and the address of the mansion folded once more in her pocket, and she did not expect to use it again. She was wrong within days. The call came from MS. Beck, not from Mujin himself, which Nyawira would later understand was its own kind of message. Mujin did not like admitting he needed anything twice in 1 week, even to himself. Rowan has refused to eat for 2 days, Ms. Beck said, her voice tight with the particular panic of someone who had already lost several jobs to this household's private grief. He will not go to sleep unless someone sits outside his door. Mr. Kwan has tried everything. He asked me to call you before he does something he'll regret, like firing the pediatrician for giving advice he doesn't like. Nyawira arrived that evening still in her work clothes, Wanjuru trailing behind her with a stuffed rabbit under one arm, and found Mujin in the doorway of his son's room, gripping the frame with white knuckles, clearly having tried and failed to convince the boy of something. He wants the light on, Mujin said, before she'd even taken her coat off. But not fully on. He says fully on is the hospital light, and he won't explain what that means, and I don't know if I'm supposed to push him to explain it or leave it alone, and every article I've read tonight contradicts the last one. Nyawira looked past him at Rowan, curled small under a blanket that looked more expensive than most cars, watching them both with wide, wary eyes. Did you read the articles standing up, sitting down, or from your phone in bed at 1 in the morning? She asked. Mujin blinked. Does that matter? No, Nyawira admitted. I just wanted to know how bad it's gotten. A short, surprised huff of air left him. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close enough that MS. Beck, hovering by the stairs, looked visibly relieved, as though she hadn't heard the sound in months and had begun to wonder if it still existed. Nyawira crouched beside Rowan's bed while Wanjuru climbed up without invitation and settled against the footboard like she'd done it 100 times. Hey, Nyawira said gently. Your dad tells me the light's too bright. Rowan's eyes flicked to his father, then back to her, as if checking whether it was safe to answer a grown-up who wasn't going to be disappointed by whatever he said. Hospitals have the bright light, he whispered. When Apple was there, it was on all night. I don't like it. Nyawira felt Mujin go very still behind her. That makes sense, she said, keeping her voice easy, unhurried. Lots of kids don't like that light. What if we found one that's more like moonlight? Not hospital light. Not dark. Just enough to see if a monster tries anything funny. Rowan considered this with the gravity of a treaty negotiation. Okay, he said finally. It took them 20 minutes to find a lamp in a storage closet 3 floors up that MS. Beck swore was somewhere in the house, and another 10 for Mujin to figure out, with visible and increasingly profane frustration, how to change its bulb from his wheelchair without simply ordering someone else to do it for him. I used to run 4 companies from a phone in my car, he muttered, wrestling with a child-proof cap on the replacement bulb's packaging. I cannot open plastic. Welcome to parenting, Nyawira said, not unkindly, and took the packaging from him without asking, tearing it open with her teeth in a way that made him stare at her like she'd performed a small miracle. By the time the lamp was glowing softly on Rowan's nightstand and the boy had finally closed his eyes, it was well past 10. Nyawira found Mujin waiting for her in the hallway outside, sitting very straight in his chair, the posture of a man trying not to look as tired as he clearly was. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet." She crossed her arms. "You need to understand something, Mr. Kwan. I'm not going to be the person who fixes this for you. I have a life. I have a job at a design studio that I am hanging on to by my fingernails because half of Seoul still assumes I don't speak Korean well enough to be trusted with clients. I have my own daughter, who needs me more than she needs to spend her evenings in this house. I understand." "I don't think you do," Nyawira said, and something in her voice made him actually look at her instead of past her. "I'll help, because that little boy in there is drowning, and because your son and my daughter have somehow decided they're best friends, and I'm not cruel enough to separate them over my own discomfort. But I am not a nanny, a therapist, or a replacement wife. If you want your son to get better, you're going to have to learn how to be his father again. Not delegate it. Learn it." Mujin's jaw worked for a moment, old pride visibly fighting something newer and more desperate. "I don't know how," he said finally, quietly, as though the words cost him something physical. "Then we start there," Nyawira said. "Tomorrow, you're going to sit with him while he eats breakfast, and you're not going to check your phone once. That's it. That's the whole assignment." "That sounds absurdly simple." "It's not," Nyawira said. "You'll see." She was right. The next evening, Ms. Beck reported that Mujin had lasted 11 minutes before an emergency call about a shipment forced him out of the room, and Rowan had gone quiet again for the rest of the day. It became, over the following weeks, a kind of ongoing education, one that humbled a man used to being obeyed in every room he entered. Nyawira taught him that Rowan hated when his rice and side dishes touched on the plate, that he needed to be warned before loud noises, that he still asked, sometimes, in a very small voice, whether his mother was coming back, and that the correct answer was never a lie dressed up as comfort. "You can't tell him she's coming back if you don't know that," Nyawira said one evening, after overhearing Mujin promise exactly that in a moment of desperate tenderness. "Kids remember every promise you break, even the kind ones. What am I supposed to say instead? The truth, sized for a 4-year-old. That you don't know. That it isn't his fault. That you're here, and you're not leaving." She met his eyes. "Only say that last part if you mean it." Mujin was quiet for a long moment. "I mean it," he said. "I have never meant anything more in my life. I simply don't know how to prove it to a child who's already watched one parent disappear." "You prove it the boring way," Nyawira said. "By showing up every day, even the days it's inconvenient. There's no shortcut. Believe me, I know. I've been proving it to my own daughter since her father decided fatherhood was a hobby he could quit. It was the first time she'd said anything about Wanjiru's father, and Mujin didn't push. He simply nodded, filing the information away the way she suspected he filed everything, and said, "Then I'll show up. Even the inconvenient days." He did not yet fully understand what those days would cost him. Because while Mujin was learning, slowly and clumsily, how to braid his son's shoelaces and sit through cartoons he found aggressively stupid, a phone call was being made across the city, one that would remind him that not everyone in his world had given up on taking what he could no longer defend. His cousin, Kwon Dae-sung, had begun quietly meeting with the board of Mujin's legitimate holding company, and in a converted warehouse near the docks, 3 men who used to answer to Mujin without hesitation were beginning, carefully, to ask each other whether a man in a wheelchair could still be feared. Weeks passed the way they do when a household is quietly rebuilding itself, not in dramatic leaps, but in small, stubborn increments that only revealed their size when you looked back far enough to notice. Rowan started eating full meals again. He began drawing once more, though his pictures had changed. Fewer suns and rainbows, more careful, repetitive drawings of two houses connected by a single road, which Nyawira noticed but did not comment on, not yet. Wanjiru had, by unanimous and entirely unofficial 4-year-old decree, declared the mansion her second home. She knew which hallway had the best echo for shouting, which cook made the best rice cakes, and exactly how to get Mujin to crack a smile by asking him increasingly absurd questions about why grown men needed so many phones. "You have 3, she told him one afternoon, watching him juggle calls at the kitchen table while Nyawira helped Rowan with a puzzle. "Do you talk to 3 different friends at the same time?" "They are not friends," Mujin said. "They are business associates who believe I have forgotten how to run a company." "That's sad," Wanjiru said, with the same brutal simplicity she'd used to diagnose his birthday party. "You should get real friends," Nyawira, without looking up from the puzzle, said, "out of the mouths of babes, Mr. Kwan." He looked at her, and something passed between them. Not quite a smile, but its close cousin, the kind of look shared between 2 adults who found the same thing quietly funny and were both too proud to say so first. It was around this time that Mujin restarted his physical therapy in earnest, after months of skipping appointments out of a mixture of exhaustion and shame. His new therapist, a broad, no-nonsense woman named Han Siola, had no patience for his temper and even less for his excuses. "You've lost 8 weeks of progress sulking," she told him during his first session back, watching him grip the parallel bars with visibly trembling arms. "Your body doesn't care how much money you have. It only cares whether you show up." "You sound like someone I know," Mujin muttered, thinking of Nyawira's voice telling him the exact same thing about fatherhood. "Then that person is smarter than you," Siola said, unbothered. The sessions were brutal. Mujin's legs, weakened for months by the illness that had stripped his nerves of their signal, shook violently even in the supported harness. He fell twice in his first week back, once hard enough to bruise his hip, and both times he ordered everyone out of the room afterward, unwilling to be seen struggling. It was Nyawira, arriving to pick up Wanjiru one evening, who found him alone in the therapy room long after his session had ended, still gripping the bars, refusing to call for help to get back into his chair. "You could have asked someone," she said, not moving to help him yet, simply observing. "I did not want anyone to see me like this. I'm someone. You are different." "Why?" He looked up at her, breathing hard, sweat at his temple, dignity stripped down to something raw and unguarded. "Because you have already seen me at the worst moment of my life, at that birthday table, and you did not look at me the way everyone else does now. Like I am something broken that used to be useful." Nyawira crossed the room slowly and crouched in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes. "I don't see broken," she said quietly. "I see a man who's furious that his body won't do what his will tells it to. That's not the same thing, isn't it?" "No," she said. "Broken people give up. You're still in this room at 9 at night, refusing to call for help out of pure stubbornness. That's not broken. That's just annoying." A laugh cracked out of him, real, surprised, entirely involuntary, and for a moment the exhaustion in his face lifted enough that she could see, underneath it, the man he must have been before illness and betrayal had worn him down to his foundations. Sharp, wry, unexpectedly warm when he let himself be. She helped him back into his chair without being asked twice, and neither of them mentioned how long her hand lingered at his shoulder before she stepped back. That same week, the mansion hosted its first school event, a small preschool showcase where the children performed a clumsy, adorable song about friendship. Rowan, who had refused to attend any school function since his mother left, stood on the small stage between Wanjuru and another classmate, and though he mumbled through most of the lyrics, he did not cry, and he did not run. Mujin watched from a folding chair near the back, having insisted on attending despite Siola's warning that a full day would exhaust him. When the song ended and the small audience of parents applauded, Nyawaira, seated beside him, saw the shine in his eyes before he blinked it away. He didn't cry, Mujin said, voice rough. No, Nyawaira agreed. He didn't. 6 months ago, I couldn't get him to leave his room. I know. He turned to look at her fully then, and the moment stretched a beat longer than either of them intended. Long enough that Nyawaira felt something warm and unfamiliar unfurl low in her chest. Long enough that Mujin's gaze dropped, just briefly, to her mouth before he caught himself and looked away, jaw tight, as though ashamed of the thought. Neither of them spoke about it in the car afterward, but something had shifted, quietly, the way weather shifts before a storm anyone admits is coming. Around the same time, Nyawaira's own life outside the mansion had not paused to accommodate her growing role in the Kwan household. Her design studio had lost a major client that month, a mid-sized fashion retailer that quietly explained, through an intermediary, that they preferred a more traditional aesthetic voice for their next campaign, a phrase Nyawaira had learned, over 2 years in Seoul, to translate accurately. She did not mention it to Mujin at first. She had spent most of her adult life solving her own problems, and some old, stubborn part of her did not want him to think she needed rescuing any more than he wanted to be seen as needing it. He found out anyway, the way he found out most things, through Ms. Beck, who had overheard Nyawaira on the phone in the kitchen, voice tight and professional, negotiating an invoice extension with a landlord who was clearly losing patience. You should have told me, Mujin said that evening, not unkindly, watching her fold Rowan's laundry with more force than the task strictly required. Told you what? That work is hard. Welcome to being an immigrant with a business degree nobody here trusts as much as they trust the same degree from a man named Daniel. She caught herself, softened. I'm not asking you to fix it. I don't want your money, Mujin. I've seen what happens to women who let rich men solve their problems. They stop being partners and start being dependents. I wasn't going to offer money, Mujin said, which was, in fact, exactly what he had been about to offer. He recalibrated quickly, an old negotiator's instinct kicking in even in his own living room. I was going to offer an introduction to people who might actually look at your portfolio instead of your accent. That's not charity. That's networking, and I have an unfair amount of it lying around and used. Nyawaira considered this for a long moment, folding a small shirt with more care than before. That, she said slowly, I could accept. As long as it's an introduction and not a favor you'll bring up during an argument in 6 months. I would never. People always say that, Nyawaira said, but she was smiling now, and the tension in her shoulders had eased. I'll take the introduction. Thank you. It was a small moment, easily missed by anyone not paying attention, but it marked something neither of them said aloud, that they were learning, clumsily and honestly, what it meant to help each other without either one losing themselves in the process. Rowan, for his part, had begun a strange new ritual that both amused and unsettled the household. Each night before bed, he insisted on counting the chairs in the dining hall out loud, all 60 of them, as though needing to confirm, nightly, that they were still there, still solid, still available should anyone decide to fill them again. Nyawaira noticed it first, mentioned it gently to Mujin, and the two of them agreed, without much discussion, that they would not discourage it. Some wounds needed their own strange rituals to heal, and a boy counting empty chairs was, Nyawaira thought, a far gentler symptom than the silence that had gripped him before. It was 3 days later that the first real threat arrived. Mujin received a courier envelope at the mansion, with no return address, containing photographs of Rowan at his preschool, taken from across the street. No note, no demand, just the clear, silent message that someone wanted him to know his son could be watched. Mujin did not tell Nyawaira immediately. He told his head of security instead, a grim, loyal man named Choi Baek-ho, one of the very few who had not abandoned him after the illness. Dae-sung, Choi said flatly, laying the photographs on the desk. He's testing whether you'll still fight for what's yours, or whether you've gone soft enough to let him take it without a war. Increase security at the preschool, Mujin said. Discreetly, I don't want Rowan frightened, and I don't want Ms. Jichuru's daughter dragged into this. She's already dragged in, Choi said quietly. The moment she started coming here every week, she became visible to everyone watching this house. You should tell her. Mujin was silent for a long moment, staring at the photographs of his son's small, unguarded face. Not yet, he said. Not until I understand how serious this is. It was the first decision he made without consulting Nyawaira, and though it seemed small at the time, it would not be the last. By early autumn, something between them had stopped pretending to be simple friendship. It showed itself in small ways. In how Mujin began waiting for Nyawaira's opinion before making decisions about Rowan, not because he needed permission, but because he had started to trust her judgment more than his own instincts. In how Nyawaira found herself dressing a little more carefully on the evenings she knew she'd see him, and hating herself faintly for it. In the charged half-second pause whenever their hands brushed passing a dish, a toy, a cup of tea, a pause that neither of them commented on, but both of them noticed. You're staring, Nyawaira told him one evening, catching him watching her from across the kitchen island while she helped Rowan with his shoes. I'm thinking, Mujin said, not remotely embarrassed, which somehow made it worse. About how you managed to make my son put his shoes on the correct feet in under a minute, when I have failed at this task for 4 months. It's not a skill, Mujin. It's patience. She glanced up, and something in his gaze made her breath catch slightly before she covered it by focusing very hard on a shoelace. You could learn it. I am trying. I know, she said, softer than she meant to. It was around this time that Mujin, against Seola's protests, insisted on attempting a longer rehabilitation session, standing unsupported between the parallel bars for the first time in months. No harness, nothing but his own weakened muscles and sheer will. He fell. Hard. This time, his knee buckling without warning, sending him crashing to the mat before Seola could catch him. Nyawaira, who had come to pick up Wanjiru and happened to be passing the therapy room, heard the sound and rushed in before she could think better of it. Mujin was on the floor, breathing hard, humiliation and pain twisting his features into something raw. Get out, he said, not looking at her. Please. No, Nyawaira said. Nyawaira. I said no. She crouched beside him, ignoring Seola's surprised glance, and did not try to help him up. She simply sat on the mat next to him, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his. You don't have to perform strength for me. I've already seen you weak. I'm still here. Something in him seemed to break open, quietly, the way ice cracks under pressure it can no longer withstand. I hate this, he said, voice raw. I hate needing help to stand. I hate that a body that used to make grown men flinch now can't hold itself up for 30 seconds. I hate that everyone who mattered left because of it, and I am terrified. He stopped himself. Terrified of what? That you will too. Eventually, when the novelty of the broken billionaire wears off. Nyawaira turned to face him fully, closer now than either of them had allowed themselves to get before. I'm not here for novelty, she said quietly. I'm here because I've watched you get back up more times than I can count, and every single time, you get back up anyway. That's not weakness. I don't know what you think I see when I look at you, Mujin, but it isn't a broken man. Then what do you see? The air between them had gone thick and quiet, the therapy room's harsh lights softened by the low evening sun through the window. Nyawaira's gaze dropped, briefly, helplessly, to his mouth, and she saw him notice, saw something shift and tighten in his expression. "I see a man I'm trying very hard not to fall for," she admitted, so quietly it was almost lost. "Which is a problem, because you're my son's, my daughter's friend's father, and my boss, sort of, and entirely too complicated for a woman who came to this country to build a simple, stable life for her daughter." "I am not your boss," Mujin said. "I have never paid you a single one. That's not the point, and you know it." "Tell me the point, then." "The point," Nyawira said, "is that I don't know how to want you without losing something of myself in the process. You have an empire. I have a studio apartment and a job I'm barely holding on to. That's not a small gap, Mujin. I don't want you to disappear into anything," he said, low and fierce, an intensity in his voice she hadn't heard directed at her before. "I have had a wife who disappeared into my money and my name until there was nothing left of the woman I married. I am not looking to repeat that. I am looking at you, specifically, not what you could become in my world, who you already are." Nyawira's breath caught. Whatever careful boundary she'd maintained for months seemed, suddenly, dangerously thin. "Mujin." He reached out, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed his fingers along her jaw. His hand was still trembling slightly from the fall, or perhaps from something else entirely. "Tell me to stop," he said, "and I will." She didn't tell him to stop. The kiss, when it came, was slow and searching, careful in the way that both of them had become careful people, two adults who had each been hurt badly enough to know exactly what they stood to lose. His hand slid to the back of her neck, hers to his jaw, and for a long moment there was nothing in the room but the two of them, and the quiet, terrifying relief of finally admitting what had been building for weeks. When they broke apart, foreheads still touching, Mujin let out a low breath. "I have wanted to do that since the night you told me I wasn't broken. That was 2 months ago. I am a patient man when it matters." Nyawira laughed, soft and a little shaky, and pressed her palm briefly against his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing beneath it. "This is going to complicate everything." "Good things usually do," Mujin said. They did not know, in that fragile, warm moment, that across the city, Zhang Haiyanju had just read a news article about Mujin's recovering health and his rebuilding company, and was already packing a suitcase. In the days following the kiss, the household adjusted itself around the new, unspoken shape of things without anyone announcing it directly. Ms. Beck began setting the table for dinner with an extra place for Nyawira as a matter of course, no longer asking whether she'd be staying. Choi Beck-ho, watching Mujin laugh. Actually laugh, not the dry huff of amusement he'd rationed out for months. At something Nyawira said over dinner one evening, remarked quietly to Ms. Beck in the kitchen that he hadn't seen the boss smile like that since before the wedding to Haiyanju, and possibly not even then. Nyawira, for her part, found herself navigating a version of Seoul she hadn't experienced before, one where doors opened a little faster, where people who might otherwise have looked past her now looked twice, uncertain how to categorize the black woman who arrived at Kwon Mujin's mansion several times a week and stayed long after the children had gone to bed. She hated the attention almost as much as she resented needing to think about it at all. "They stare," she admitted to Mujin one night, sitting across from him at the kitchen island long after Rowan and Wanjuru had fallen asleep on the couch watching cartoons neither of them cared about. "Your driver. The delivery man who brings the groceries." Even Ms. Beck, in the beginning, though she stopped now. "I came to this country to build something quiet and stable for my daughter, not to become the subject of gossip in a mafia boss's household." "Former mafia boss," Mujin said. "Mostly. That's not the reassurance you think it is." He reached across the island and took her hand, turning it over gently, tracing the lines of her palm with a thumb, an easy, unhurried intimacy that had grown between them without either of them marking the exact day it began. "I can't undo the staring," he said. "I wish I could." What I can tell you is that none of it changes what I see when I look at you, which is not a curiosity and not an experiment and not something exotic to be admired from a safe distance. I see a woman who terrifies me slightly because she is the first person in years who has made me want to be better instead of simply more feared. That was almost poetic, Nyawira said, though her voice had gone soft. Almost. Ciola tells me I ruin every sentimental moment by talking too much like a man reading a contract. She's not wrong. No, Mujin admitted, she rarely is. Their laughter, low and easy in the quiet kitchen, was interrupted only by Wanjru wandering and half asleep in search of water, blinking at the sight of the two adults sitting close together with their fingers still loosely intertwined, and announcing, with the devastating honesty only a 4-year-old could manage, "You two are going to get married." Rowan says so too. Neither of them denied it, which felt, to both of them later, like its own kind of confession. Hyunju arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the kiss in the therapy room, without warning and without shame. She looked, Nyawira would later think, exactly like a woman who had spent someone else's stolen money until it ran out. Expensively dressed in clothes a season out of style, her composure just a shade too rehearsed. "I've come to see my son," Hyunju announced to Ms. Beck at the door, and by the time Mujin wheeled himself into the foyer, she had already stepped inside. "Mujin," she said, and there were, absurdly, tears in her eyes. "You're walking. Well, you're standing, at least. I heard you were recovering, and I couldn't stay away any longer. I've been ashamed every day since I left." Mujin studied her for a long moment, feeling old anger and older habit both stir in him. "You left our son without saying goodbye." "I was drowning, Mujin. Watching you like that, it broke something in me. I couldn't handle it. I know that isn't an excuse. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But Rowan is still my child. Don't I get the chance to be his mother again?" It was, Mujin would later admit to himself, precisely engineered to strike the one part of him he could never fully protect, his guilt over what his son had lost, and his fear of being the reason Rowan grew up without a mother at all. "I need time to think," he said. "Of course," Hyunju said, and touched his arm gently before he could pull it back. "Take all the time you need. I'll stay nearby, for Rowan's sake." That evening, Mujin made the decision that would cost him almost everything he had rebuilt. He allowed Hyunju to visit Rowan at the mansion the following afternoon, without telling Nyawira first. Nyawira found out the way people usually find out about things they should have been told directly, by walking in. She arrived to pick up Wanjuru and found Hyunju in the living room, seated close to Rowan on the couch, showing him photographs on her phone, while Mujin watched from across the room with an expression Nyawira couldn't immediately read. The temperature in the room seemed to drop the moment Nyawira stepped through the doorway. "You must be the woman my son mentions constantly," Hyunju said, rising smoothly, her smile polished and cool. "I'm Rowan's mother." "I know who you are," Nyawira said, and looked at Mujin, whose face had gone carefully blank in the specific way she'd learned meant he knew he'd made a mistake and hadn't yet decided how to handle it. She did not make a scene. She collected Wanjuru with quiet, controlled movements, said a brief goodbye to Rowan, and left the mansion without another word to Mujin. He called her that night. She let it ring out twice before answering. "You should have told me," Nyawira said, before he could speak. "Not asked my permission. I'm not asking for a veto over your family, Mujin. But you let me walk into a room and find out, in front of your son, that his mother was back in the house, sitting closer to him than I've ever been allowed to sit, and you didn't think that was worth a phone call." "I didn't know how to tell you," Mujin admitted. "I was afraid of how you'd react, and I was trying to figure out what was right for Rowan first." "That's the problem," Nyawira said, voice tightening with something raw and long-held. "You keep making decisions about the family we're building as if I'm not already part of it. Do you understand what it took for me to let myself fall for you? I have a daughter who calls this house her second home. I have let myself hope for something I have no right to hope for, given everything I have to lose if it falls apart. And you just showed me, in one afternoon, exactly how easily I could be pushed to the side the moment something more familiar walks back through your door. Hyunju is not more familiar to me than you are, Mujin said, sharper than he meant to. She is Rowan's mother. I have an obligation. I'm not asking you to abandon your obligation to your son, Nyawira cut in. I'm asking you to include me in decisions that affect my daughter's best friend, and by extension, my daughter, and by extension me. That's not a small thing, Mujin. That's the entire thing. There was a long silence on the line. I made a mistake, Mujin said finally, quietly. I should have told you before she ever set foot in this house. Yes, Nyawira said. You should have. Can we? I need distance, Nyawira said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying how much it cost her to say it. Not forever. I don't know. I just need to not feel temporary for a while, Mujin. I've felt temporary my whole life, in more ways than you know. I can't feel it here too. She ended the call before he could respond. The mansion, over the following 2 weeks, became quiet again in the particular way it had been quiet on the night of Rowan's birthday, full of expensive things and empty of warmth. Rowan, sensing the absence of Wanjiru and the tension in his father, withdrew again, refusing to draw, refusing to eat properly, asking Ms. Beck in a small voice whether Nyawira was gone the way his mother had been gone. Mujin, watching his son slip backward into the silence they had worked so hard to pull him out of, began to understand exactly what he had risked. Meanwhile, Hyunju's visits continued, each one slightly bolder than the last. She began speaking to household staff as though she had never left, questioning decisions, hinting to Ms. Beck that things would return to how they should be soon. And in a private meeting Mujin knew nothing about, she sat across a table from his cousin Daesung in a dim restaurant near the financial district. He's vulnerable, Hyunju said, sliding a folder across the table. Guilt over the boy, distracted by some foreign woman he's fallen for. If you move for guardianship claims now, using my testimony about his instability after the illness, the board will have grounds to question his competency to run the company at all. Daesung studied her carefully. And what do you want out of this? Access, Hyunju said simply. To my son. To the life I gave up. I don't care what happens to his companies. I care about not being poor again. That, Daesung said, with a thin smile, I can arrange. Neither of them noticed Choi Baekho's contact in the restaurant's kitchen staff, quietly photographing the meeting from across the room. Choi brought the photographs and a recording of the restaurant conversation to Mujin 3 days later, setting them on the desk without a word. Mujin listened to the recording twice, his expression darkening with each pass, old instincts sharpening back into focus. The instincts of a man who had once made his name through strategy rather than sentiment. They think I've gone soft, he said finally. Have you? Choi asked, not unkindly. No, Mujin said. I've gone honest. That's different, and it's about to become very inconvenient for both of them. He called an emergency meeting of his company's board that same week, arriving not in the wheelchair he'd grown used to hiding behind meetings for months, but standing, gripping a cane, Seola's hard-won progress finally, proving its worth at the moment it mattered most. His legs shook under him. He did not sit down once during the entire meeting. He laid out, calmly and with devastating precision, the recorded conversation between Daesung and Hyunju. The falsified guardianship claims Daesung had begun quietly preparing, and financial records showing Daesung had been diverting company resources into shell accounts for the better part of a year. I built this company back from nothing once, Mujin told the board, voice steady despite the visible effort it took to remain standing. I will not pretend illness has made me a different man in every way. I am still capable of protecting what is mine. But I have learned, this year, that strength built only on fear collapses the moment the fear does. I would rather build something that survives because people choose to stay, not because they're too afraid to leave. He proposed, to the board's visible shock, a formal separation between the legitimate holding company, which would be run transparently, its criminal ties severed over the next 18 months under legal counsel he had quietly retained, and the older, darker infrastructure his father had built decades before, which he intended to dissolve entirely rather than pass to a successor who would only repeat its worst instincts. Daesung, cornered by the recording and the financial evidence, was removed from the board within the hour, his attempted guardianship claim collapsing before it ever reached a courtroom. Hyunju's involvement became public knowledge shortly after, and whatever fragile claim she had rebuilt to Rowan's trust dissolved along with it. Moojin did not banish her from his son's life entirely. He arranged, through proper legal channels, for supervised visits twice a month, enough for Rowan to know his mother still existed without exposing him to her instability. It was not forgiveness. It was, Moojin told himself, simply what was fair to a 4-year-old who hadn't chosen any of this. That evening, standing on his own 2 legs longer than he had in over a year, leaning heavily on his cane, exhausted in every possible way, Moojin went to find Nyawira. She opened her apartment door already knowing, somehow, what this was. "You're standing," she said quietly. "Barely," Moojin admitted. "I wanted to be standing when I said this, even if it cost me tomorrow's session with Seola." "Said what?" "I was wrong," he said, no excuses trailing the words, nothing softened for his own comfort. "I let you feel temporary in a house you helped rebuild. I made a decision about my son's mother without including the woman who has done more real parenting for him in 6 months than I managed in 4 years. I told myself I was protecting Rowan, but the truth is I was afraid of choosing you over old guilt, afraid of what it meant that I wanted to choose you at all. I am sorry, Nyawira. Not because I've lost something without you, because you deserved better than what I gave you." Nyawira's eyes were wet, and she didn't bother hiding it. "I was scared too," she admitted. "Not just of losing you, of how much I'd already let myself need you and Rowan. I built my whole life around not needing anyone I couldn't count on, and then you two went and became the exception, and I didn't know how to be angry at you without also admitting how much it would hurt to actually lose you." "You won't lose me," Moojin said. "I am not going anywhere, even on the days it's inconvenient. Especially on those days." She let him in, that night, past the doorway and past every careful boundary she'd built to protect herself. Their second kiss was nothing like the careful, searching first one. It was certain, unhurried, full of everything unspoken over the 2 weeks of silence between them, his hand at her waist, hers curled into the front of his shirt, both of them breathing like they'd been holding something back for far longer than 2 weeks. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, foreheads resting together in the dim light of her small apartment, neither of them said anything else that night that needed saying out loud. They did, however, talk. Later, after Wanjiru had been tucked in and the apartment had gone quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator Nyawira kept meaning to replace. They sat together on her narrow couch, her legs draped over his lap, his hand resting absently on her ankle, and for the first time since the argument, they let themselves speak plainly about everything that had been sitting unspoken between them for months. "I need you to understand something," Nyawira said, staring at the ceiling rather than at him, which she always did when the thing she needed to say mattered too much to risk his reaction. "Part of what made me so angry wasn't just Hyunju showing up. It was watching how easily this world can swallow a person whole. I've seen it happen to women who married into money here. They start out as themselves and slowly become an accessory to someone else's story. I am terrified of becoming that. Of Wanjiru growing up watching her mother disappear into somebody else's name. You are the least disappearing person I have ever met," Moojin said. You argue with my head of security. You corrected my company's onboarding paperwork last month because you found it, in your words, insultingly vague. I do not think you are capable of vanishing into anything, Nyawaira, least of all me. People think that about themselves right up until it happens. Then hold me to it, Mujin said simply. Every time you feel yourself shrinking in this house, tell me. I would rather be corrected 100 times than lose the version of you I fell for by pretending everything is fine. Nyawaira turned her head to look at him properly then, something in her chest loosening at the plainness of the offer. Not a grand romantic gesture, just an ordinary, sturdy promise, the kind that could actually be kept. That, she said, is the least poetic thing you've ever said to me, and somehow the thing I needed most. Siola would be proud, Mujin said dryly, and Nyawaira laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, the sound loosening something in both of them that had been wound too tight since the night Hyunju walked back through his door. They talked, too, about the harder things, about race, and how Nyawaira had learned to read a room in Seoul the way she'd once had to learn new streets, cataloging which spaces welcomed her and which merely tolerated her, about disability, and how Mujin had spent a year mourning the man he used to be before he'd let himself notice the man he was becoming instead, about motherhood and fatherhood, and the particular loneliness of raising a child while grieving a version of family that hadn't survived. Neither of them solved anything that night in the way problems get solved in stories told for entertainment. They simply understood each other a little more than they had the night before, which both of them agreed, quietly, was really all love ever managed to do at its best. A year passed the way good years do, quickly and gratefully, without announcing themselves as good until they were nearly over. Mujin walked with a cane most days now, the wheelchair reserved for longer distances or the days his body simply refused to cooperate, which came less often but still came. Siola remained brutally unimpressed by his progress, which he had come to understand was the highest compliment she offered anyone. His company operated, for the first time in decades, without the shadow infrastructure his father had built. It was smaller. It was, by some measures, less powerful. It was also, according to every board member who had once feared him and now merely respected him, the most stable it had been in years. Nyawaira had left the design studio that never fully trusted her judgment and started her own small firm, 6 months in and already turning a careful profit, built on the reputation of a woman who had learned, the hard way, exactly what she was worth and refused to accept less. Mujin had offered, more than once, to invest. She had refused, more than once, just as firmly. I need this to be mine, she told him. Every bit of it. I understand that better than most people could, he said, and meant it. Rowan, now 5, had become nearly unrecognizable from the silent boy at the birthday table, loud again, curious again, prone to elaborate questions about how airplanes stayed in the sky and why his father's cane had a different handle than grandfather Salah's patience used. He and Wanjuru remained inseparable, their friendship having weathered a full year of shared birthdays, shared tantrums, and one memorable incident involving a permanent marker and the mansion's east hallway wall that neither adult had fully recovered from discussing. On Rowan's 6th birthday, the mansion filled with 60 chairs again. This time, every single one of them was full. Ms. Beck had insisted on the same cake recipe from the year before, for good luck, and the marble corridors that had once echoed with only one small, sad boy's footsteps now rang with the noise of a dozen children and their families. Staff who had stayed through the worst of it now laughing openly in the kitchen, and Choi Beck-ho standing near the door not out of grim necessity, but simple habit, smiling despite himself at the chaos. Mujin stood at the head of the table this year, cane in hand, watching his son blow out candles surrounded by people who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to be there. After the cake, after the gifts, after Wanjuru had once again crowned someone with a paper crown, this time placing it, giggling, on Nyawira's head instead. Mujin found a quiet moment and asked Nyawira to step outside onto the mansion's terrace, where the autumn evening had cooled the air just enough to be pleasant. "You're doing the thing," Nyawira said, eyeing him. "The thing where you get very formal right before you say something important." "I have been informed I do that," Mujin admitted, and reached into his jacket pocket with a hand that trembled slightly. "Not, this time, from illness. A year ago, I did not believe I had anything left worth offering anyone. I thought my worth had been tied entirely to what my body and my name could command. You taught my son that he was allowed to be sad without being abandoned for it. You taught me the same thing, though I doubt you meant to." He opened the small box, and the ring inside caught the last of the evening light. "I am not asking you to save me," he said. "I've had enough people try to fix me to know that isn't what love is supposed to be. I am asking you to keep choosing this, the inconvenient days included, because I intend to keep choosing you, for as long as you'll let me. Marry me, Nyawira." Nyawira looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had learned to stand again not for his own pride, but for his son, who had dismantled an empire built on fear rather than pass its cruelty forward, who had apologized without excuses and rebuilt trust without demanding it be rushed. "Yes," she said, and laughed through the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, obviously yes, you impossible man." Inside, through the terrace doors, Rowan and Wanjuru pressed their faces against the glass, having clearly abandoned all pretense of not watching. And when Mujin slid the ring onto Nyawira's hand, the two children erupted into a cheer that brought half the party rushing to the windows to see what the fuss was about. Later that night, once the guests had gone and the children had finally, exhaustedly fallen asleep curled together on the living room couch, Mujin sat beside Nyawira on the terrace steps, his cane resting against the railing, her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember what my son asked me the night we met?" Mujin said quietly. "He asked if everyone had forgotten me too. I remember. I used to believe people left because I could no longer stand," Mujin said. "That my worth was measured entirely in what I could still command. You never once let me believe that. You were never worth less," Nyawira said, tilting her head up to look at him. "The people who left were never really loyal to you, Mujin. Not to the man underneath all of it. They were loyal to what you could give them. And you?" Nyawira smiled and pressed a kiss to the corner of his jaw, unhurried and certain. "I'm not here because you can stand," she said. "I'm here because you never stopped trying to, even when you had every reason to give up. That's the man I fell for. He's still worth walking toward, cane and all." Inside the house, the last candle from the birthday cake still sat unlit on the counter, waiting, harmlessly, for nothing at all. Because for the first time in longer than anyone in that house could remember, there was nothing left to wish for that they did not already have.